Good evening, good afternoon, good morning in whatever time zone you are. Welcome to everybody joining us on Zoom as well as Facebook and other platforms. If you are on Zoom and you would like to use the Khmer language translation, please use the settings at the bottom of the screen under interpretation, and you can switch to Khmer. On behalf of the Never Again Association, as well as personally, I cannot emphasize enough what an honor it is to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Ben Kiernan. Professor Kernan was born in Australia with some family roots in Poland, I believe. And he is the author of a large number of significant books, including the Pol Pot regime. This copy, as you can see, has been read quite carefully. And I think one of the important aspects of this very, very significant book is the subtitle, Race, Power, and Genocide in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, which tells us that at the heart of the Khmer Rouge ideology was racism and extreme nationalism, which I think is one of the most important lessons I drew from reading it. But Professor Kiernan has written much more, including the book under the title Blood and Soil, A World History of Genocide and Extermination from Sparta to Darfur. And I think throughout his career, Professor Kiernan emphasized what we try to stress also in the frame of this project. We want to note the commonalities as well as differences between different instances of genocide in world history. And this is something that allows us to build solidarity and empathy and contribute to intercultural understanding and intercultural dialogue, as well as to fight denial and distortion. Among many other achievements of Professor Kernan, he was the founding director of the Cambodian Genocide Program at Yale University, as well as the Genocide Studies Program at Yale. So without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Professor Kernan, please.
Thank you very much, Rafal. It's a great honor for me to be here today, and I look forward to further discussions. In Cambodia in 1980, the year after the overthrow of Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge regime, it was common enough to hear Cambodians remark, Pol Pot a krach chieng Hitler, pi pro Hitler ban samlap ta juif, ko pantai Pol Pot samlapប្រជាជនខ្មែររបស់ខ្លួនឯង. Pol Pot was worse than Hitler because Hitler killed only Jews, but Pol Pot killed his own Khmer people. Now, this statement was rarely intended to belittle the fate of the Jews in the Holocaust, nor was it often intended to deny what had happened to Hitler's other victims. The statement was mostly Cambodians' way of drawing attention to their recent persecution by the Khmer Rouge in 1975 to 79, which the United Nations General Assembly at that time was still ignoring, and it did not become the subject of international legal prosecutions until over a quarter of a century later, in 2006. But these kinds of statements did implicitly understate the genocide of the Jews and also overlook the genocide of the Roma people, as well as all the other mass murders committed by Hitler of both Germans and foreigners. Close to home in Southeast Asia, there were precedents for distortion of the Holocaust and of the anti-Semitism that lay behind it, and even for post-war emulation of Nazi policies. For instance, in South Vietnam in the late 1950s and early 1960s, President Ngo Dinh Diem's younger brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, ran the South Vietnamese regime's political party, the Can Lao. Its official ideology was personalism, but the Can Lao's youth wing, the Republican Youth, was modeled directly after the Hitler Youth, with similar brown shirts and militaristic assemblies, according to the historian David Biggs. A third brother, Ngo Dinh Can, who ran central Vietnam like his own personal fiefdom, required all village youth to join the Republican Youth. Those children who did not attend rallies or assist local military forces were deemed to be anti-government or worse, Vietnamese communists. David Biggs comments that Can drew globally from such groups as the brown shirts of Nazi Germany to give a logic to his program of destruction. Several CIA and US observers at the time concluded that Diem's regime was an emerging, quote, fascist state, unquote. How could this have happened in Southeast Asia? The Kingdom of Siam was the only country in Southeast Asia not to be colonized by a European power. Before ascending the Siamese throne in 1910 as the country's absolute monarch, King Vajirabhut, who reigned from 1910 to 1925, had spent many years in England. But he maintained that, quote, my dip in European educational waters has given me but a European gloss. The flesh inside is still very much Thai. The king opposed what he called the Siamese cult of imitation of Western influences, and he urged his countrymen to think and act for ourselves, rejecting Western racial prejudices, such as the concept of the yellow peril. He insisted that the Thai were equal to Europeans, and he warned against hating other nations. In 1914, Vajirabhut, as King of Siam, published an article entitled The Jews of the Orient, which began with a 30-page discussion of anti-Jewism, as he called it, in Europe. Whilst in Europe, Vajirabhut wrote, I could not fail to notice the anti-Jewish feeling which loomed so large in almost every country in Europe, notably in Russia, Germany, and France. In England, he went on, the feeling was undoubtedly present, though it was not so apparent on the surface as in other countries. I then set myself the question, why this anti-Jewish feeling? What have the Jews done? He wrote in 1914. In Spain, in 1912, 22 Spanish bishops endorsed the foundation of the National Anti-Masonic and Anti-Semitic League. That was its official title. The Bishop of Almeria endorsed the decisive battle, as he said, that must be unleashed between the children of light and the children of darkness, between Catholicism and Judaism, between Christ and the devil. As the historian Paul Preston puts it, Spain had few Jews, but, quote, anti-Semitism was central to integrist Catholicism. By the 1930s, persistent reminders of Judas's betrayal of Jesus and of medieval myths about Jewish ritual killings of children became compounded by Catholic fears of revolution and the idea that all members of left-wing parties were, quote, stooges of the Jews, now dramatized by small numbers of Jewish refugees who were fleeing from Nazism and arriving in Spain. In August-September 1933, the Spanish politician Gil Robles, Secretary General of the Catholic Agrarian National Confederation and leader of the Spanish Confederation of the Autonomous Right, attended the Nazi Congress in Nuremberg, 1933. On his return to Spain, Robles restated Catholic objections to violence and to Nazi pantheism. However, he went on, in fascism, there is much to approve of, including, quote, its exaltation of patriotic values, its clear anti-Marxist significance, its enmity to liberal and parliamentary democracy. Robles concluded, all of this provides a guideline for a new order of things that we are duty-bound to pick up in order to harmonize it with the postulates of the Catholic doctrine. Within a month, Robles was ready to declare a new reality, as he stated. First Italy and then Germany, the two nations that today weigh most decisively on world politics, march with a firm step on the path of anti-democracy. Against corrosive liberalism, germ of all anarchies, a totalitarian conception of the state, channeling the maximum energies of a race. In mid-October 1933, Robles announced, we have to found a new state to clean the country of Judaic Masons. What does it matter if we have to spill blood? Our need is for complete power, and that is what we ask for. Now, Gilles Robles was no Nazi, not even a fascist. These anti-Semitic ideas were far more widespread than that. Robles was an influential right-wing interwar leader who often chose to distinguish his Catholic agrarian movement from fascism. He never belonged to the Spanish Falange Party, nor ever became a central figure in the regime of General Francisco Franco. But Robles shared and admired many of their ideas, and even those of the Nazis, including their anti-Semitic and racist goals. The Francoists did too. In December 1933, Franco's fellow officer and future senior director of the 1936 military coup that launched the Spanish Civil War, General Emilio Mola, he wrote that decadent nations are the favorite victims of parasitical international organizations, just as unhealthy organisms are the most fertile breeding ground of the virulent spread of pathological germs. It is significant, he went on, that all such organizations are manipulated, if not actually directed by the Jews, unquote. Mola then said, the Jews don't care about the destruction of a nation or of 10 or of the entire world because they, having the exceptional ability to derive benefit from the greatest catastrophes, are merely completing their program. The German Chancellor, Hitler, a fanatical nationalist, is convinced that his people cannot rise again as long as the Jews and the parasitical organizations that they control or influence remain embedded in the nation. That is why he persecutes them without quarter, unquote. Soon after launching the July 1936 coup in Spain, Mola explicitly denounced, quote, parliamentary democratic systems inspired by the erroneous doctrines of Jews, Freemasons, anarchists, and Marxists. All those who oppose the victory of the movement to save Spain will be shot, unquote. Juan Antonio Suances joined Franco's circle of advisors and collaborators around mid-1937 at the height of the Spanish Civil War. Suances drafted guidelines that Franco made the basis of his economic program. This document denounced the, quote, Judeo-Masonic conspiracy against Spain, as well as Judaism and Marxist international organizations. In several other spheres too, Franco's policies drew upon Italian fascist and Nazi ideology and their implementation. Francoists perpetrated around 3/4 of the murders and executions in Spain during and after the Civil War. Franco himself firmly believed that Jews, Masons, and Bolsheviks cohabited in what he called a filthy concubinage, contubernio. At his Madrid victory parade in May 1939, Franco warned that, quote, the Jewish spirit which permitted the alliance of big capital with Marxism and which was behind so many pacts with the anti-Spanish Revolution cannot be extirpated in a day. On December 31st, 1939, Franco praised Germany's anti-Semitic laws. Now you will understand, Franco said, the reasons which have led other countries to persecute and isolate those races marked by the stigma of their greed and self-interest. We cannot remain indifferent before the modern flourishing of avaricious and selfish spirits who are so attached to their own earthly goods that they would sacrifice the lives of their children. During the Civil War, Franco's forces tracked down and killed Jews in Spain, forcibly baptized others, and deported yet others to Nazi Germany. In 1938, at the suggestion of Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, Franco's regime signed an agreement to hand over to the Gestapo captured Jews, communists, and socialists who had fought in the international brigades in defense of the Spanish Republic. The Gestapo, in turn, trained Franco's political police. Franco's Spain awarded Himmler its highest decoration, the Grand Cross of the Imperial Order of the Yoke and Arrows. Hitler himself awarded Franco the Golden Grand Cross of the Order of the German Eagle. In May 1941, Franco ordered his officials to draw up a list of some 6,000 Jews living in Spain for inclusion in, quote, a secret Jewish archive. The list was then handed over to Himmler, El País newspaper reported in 2010. The original order, partially preserved in Zaragoza province archives, had instructed provincial governors to elaborate lists of all the national and foreign Jews living in the province in Spain, showing their personal and political leanings, means of living, commercial activities, degree of danger, and security category. Governors were ordered to be especially vigilant for Sephardic Jews, descendants of those expelled from Spain in 1492. Their adaptation to our environment and their similar temperament allow them to hide their origins more easily, said the 1941 order, which referred to this notorious race who remained unnoticed with no opportunity of preventing their easily carried out attempts at subversion. Ireland was another nation on the western fringe of Europe that, like Spain, adopted neutrality during World War II. In the pre-war period, it too failed to escape some of the distinguishing political and ideological influences which marked that global conflict. In 1927, the Irish government appointed the Austrian archaeologist Alfred Marr as keeper of Irish antiquities. On April 1st, 1933, the month after Hitler attained power in Germany, but 5 years before Germany's annexation of Austria, Alfred Marr joined the German Nazi Party. A year later, Ireland's Prime Minister, Eamon de Valera, promoted Marr to the influential position of Director of the National Museum of Ireland. It is uncertain whether de Valera was yet aware of Marr's Nazi Party membership. But Marr was already serving as chief advisor and sponsor for the Harvard archaeological expedition in Ireland from 1932 to 36. The organizer and manager of the Harvard mission, Ernest A. Houghton, a member of the American Eugenics Society, had chosen Ireland for its research, in part because he believed that the Celtic language was, quote, an archaic Aryan language. By 1939, the Assistant Secretary of Ireland's Department of External Affairs described Marr as, quote, the most active and fanatical National Socialist in the German colony in Ireland. From Dublin, Maar headed the Auslandorganisation, considered useful for propaganda and espionage activities. In the 1930s, Maar reported back to Berlin, identifying which of the Germans in Ireland were of Jewish descent. Dublin retained Maar as director of the National Museum after his membership of the Nazi Party became public, even after Hitler's conferral of a professorship on Maar in 1938 and Maar's return to Germany the next year, technically on a leave of absence to attend a conference. He never returned. In 1944, Maar attended a joint SS Propaganda Office and Foreign Office conference and urged those present to draw up lists of, quote, pro-Jewish Freemasons, journalists, writers, and economists. He may well also have contributed to the 1942 Wannsee Protocol's inclusion of a figure for Ireland among countries yet to be occupied by the Nazis as home to an estimated 4,000 Jews. After Hitler's suicide in 1945, Eamon de Valera visited Dublin's German embassy and signed the condolence book. By contrast, other neutral nations, Sweden and Switzerland, presented no condolences. The same was true of neutral Portugal, though flags flew at half-mast on public buildings there. Only Ireland and Franco's Spain offered condolences to Berlin upon Hitler's death. Meanwhile, the influence of the anti-Semitic model had spread far beyond the Atlantic fringes of Europe. When in 1914, Siam's King Vajirabhut published under a pseudonym his article that I mentioned before, entitled The Jews of the Orient, as the historian Walter Weller wrote, the king borrowed heavily on anti-Semitic thoughts of the West, thoughts the king had certainly become familiar with during his long years in England. In his 1914 article, King Vajirabhut asserted that Southeast Asia's ethnic Chinese minority were, quote, the Jews of the Orient. Western anti-Semitism fit well into the king's conception of the ethnic Chinese minority in Thailand. The previous year, Vajirabhut had written another essay in which he aggressively called for the replacement of Chinese clan names with Thai names. In the words of Thai historian Kasian Tejapira, the king's 1913 essay associated Chinese clan names with, quote, belligerent gangster solidarity, archaism, barbarism, group inclusion, national division, and political insubordination. The king's article the next year struck what would become a familiar vein in anti-Semitism. He wrote, quote, I have not been actuated by any ulterior motives, nor did I start out upon my investigations as a confirmed Chinaphobe. On the contrary, I had every reason to have friendly feelings for the Chinese, not only because they were fellow Asiatics, but also because of the personal friendship which I have enjoyed since boyhood with many Chinamen personally. Vajirabhut's explanations for what he called, what have the Jews done, are an example of the spread of anti-Semitism across the globe, even before World War I. The Siamese king identified three reasons for this anti-Jewish feeling, as he put it, each in turn being, in his view, the fault of the Jews. First of all, he wrote, quote, the most prominent characteristic of the Jew, is race. No matter where he lives or what nationality he adopts, he is always a Jew. And other people are never allowed to forget it either. This element of race, so strongly and persistently present in every individual Jew, is without doubt the principal reason why they cannot get along in peace with the Gentile inhabitants of the countries where they reside. unquote. Of course, the king himself was hardly immune to racialist thinking and the increasingly prevalent negative stereotyping of Jews. He asserted that, quote, the Jew will do all he can to evade military duties, though he is never known to have refused the benefits gained as the result of any war. Jewish financiers never have any scruples about trying to bring about wars or sharing in the profits derived from supplying troops in wartime. But when it comes to the question of fighting, they themselves do all they can to evade it, unquote. Vajirabhut then added, quote, the attitude of superiority and offishness, or worse still, the attitude of grudging condescension adopted by the Jews naturally gives grave offense to their Gentile neighbors. This is reason number one of anti-Jewism, unquote. Second, the king argued, quote, the black man does not enjoy being called, and here he used the N word. And he went on, quote, and if he is strong enough, will resent the insult. So in a similar manner, the Christian European deeply resents being called a Gentile by the Jew, knowing that the Jew means the word as an epithet expressive of contempt. There then is reason number two of anti-Jewism, unquote. Here, Vajirabhut had managed to overlook any contempt for Jews on the part of the Christian European and to contrast rather than compare Jews with another victim of prejudice, quote, the black man. The third, and the king wrote, I think the most important reason for anti-Jewism is to be found in the Jews' extraordinarily acute money-making instinct and all the evil results arriving therefrom. He went on, quote, he is able to close his eyes to the sight and his ears to the sound of misery directly caused by the practice of his cult. For would not a Jewish moneylender let his victim starve rather than forego his exorbitant interest on his loan? He went on, quote, all these acts the Jew is able and often willing to do with a callousness which would amaze a Central African cannibal, and all for the sake of the cult of money, which has become as second nature to him, unquote. Vajirabhut then attempted to explain, quote, the slaughter of Jews in Russia in the then ongoing pre-World War I pogroms in that country. The king wrote that, quote, I never was in Russia long enough to be able to learn the truth of the matter, unquote. But he conjectured, as he put it, that it was not the work of the Tsarist government, although it, quote, knows the sufferings caused by the Jews to the Russian peasants, unquote. Rather, the king thought, the peasants, quote, goaded by misery and poverty, break loose and commit violence against the Jews who have been the cause of their misery, unquote. As for the Chinese in Siam, the king wrote in similar vein, where money is concerned, the Chinese are utterly without morals, without conscience, without mercy, without pity. They will cheat with a smile at their own cleverness and rob and murder with utter callousness for the sake of getting a few dollars, unquote. They would then send the money back to China, quote, like so many vampires who steadily suck dry an unfortunate victim's lifeblood, unquote. In this, he went on, they were worse than the Jews, Vajirabhut argued, for Jews had no country of their own and spent their wealth in the land in which they resided. On the other hand, the king conceded, the Chinese, who did have a home country, at least did not get involved in local politics, as Jews did. This was fortunate, the king thought, because otherwise the Chinese, quote, might prove very troublesome. The Chinese in Siam, he wrote, were, quote, every bit as unscrupulous and as unconscionable as the Jews, and, quote, no more Buddhists than are the Jews Christians, while Siamese were, quote, no more like the Chinese than any of the European races are like the Jews, unquote. The historian Walter Weller observed that after this essay was published in 1914, quote, the king noted with particular pleasure its good reception by Europeans, unquote. It is important to specify here that King Vajirabhut of Siam, who died in 1925, did not and could not have participated in Holocaust denial. And in describing the pervasiveness of racism in the early 20th century, Vajirabhut was certainly correct. Its influence and impact were clearly felt far beyond Europe, and in elite Siam, it fell on fertile soil. Even anti-Semitism in particular persisted in Siam beyond the overthrow of its absolute monarchy in 1932. In the late 1930s, the country's defense minister and future wartime dictator, Phibun Songkhram, who had received high-level military training in France in the mid-1920s, fostered the publication in Thai of books and articles favorable to Hitler and Mussolini. In a 1938 public lecture at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, Luang Wichit Watakan, a close associate of Phibun, compared the Chinese in Siam to the Jews of Germany. And after mentioning Hitler's policies against the Jews, he said that, quote, it was high time Siam considered dealing with their own Jews, unquote. Phibun took power in Bangkok later that same year. In 1939, he changed Siam's name to Thailand, and he decreed that a new national anthem be sung twice daily throughout the country. Its first line was, quote, Thailand unites the Thai blood and race, unquote. During World War II, Phibun forged a military alliance with Japan, with Luang Wichit, whom I quoted before, as his foreign minister and ambassador to Tokyo. Japanese wartime expansionism across Southeast Asia in 1942 to 45 included massacres of many thousands of ethnic Chinese in Singapore and elsewhere, as it had in China itself, for instance, in the 1937 Nanjing massacre. Taking advantage of Thailand's status as an ally of an expanding Japanese empire, Phibun's Bangkok regime seized large territories from all four of Thailand's neighbors, Cambodia, Laos, Burma, and Malaya. Thailand was not the only Asian country to encounter the influence of pre-war Nazi anti-Semitism. In 1939, the right-wing Indian politician M.S. Golwalkar wrote in his book, We or Our Nationhood Defined, quote, to keep up the purity of the nation and its culture, Germany shocked the world by her purging the country of Semitic races, the Jews. National pride at its highest has been manifested here. Germany has also shown how well nigh impossible it is for races and cultures having differences going to the roots to be assimilated into one united whole. A good lesson for us in Hindustan to learn and profit by, unquote. Meanwhile, an emerging Southeast Asian state offered a stark contrast to all this. Having formally set out in 1935 on the road to independence from the United States, the then Commonwealth of the Philippines provided sanctuary in Manila to no fewer than 1,200 Jewish refugees in 1938 and 1939. Their acceptance by the Philippines was a result of cooperation between the US High Commissioner in Manila, Paul McNutt, and the Commonwealth of the Philippines elected president, the veteran Philippine nationalist leader, Manuel Quezon, as well as the local Jewish community in Manila. One of the Jewish refugees, Frank Ephraim, who had fled Berlin with his family in early 1939, only to endure the 3-year Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia, later set down his experiences in a memoir entitled Escape to Manila, From Nazi Tyranny to Japanese Terror. The global backdrop to 20th century genocide certainly included the spread of anti-Semitism, racism, and territorial expansionism, but also examples of humanitarian resistance and at least temporary refuge. The Philippine case also showed that independent nationalism did not have to involve racial persecution. In his book, Denial, History Betrayed, Tony Taylor sets out 4 categories of behavior that may appropriately be applied to genocide denial. The first is, quote, simple denial, despite overwhelmingly contrary evidence that is generally regarded as unassailable, unquote. The second involved deeds or taking action to support denial. This may also be described as attempted cover-up or of the facts of the case. Taylor's third category is fantasy. In other words, he says, maintaining a belief in unsound ideas by creating a fantasy around the object of the denial. For instance, the view that, quote, Adolf Hitler was a much maligned leader, unquote. And the fourth category is, quote, the use of carefully chosen words to perpetuate the mistaken belief. The former Khmer Rouge leaders of Cambodia certainly attempted to whitewash their records and deny their involvement in genocide. As early as 1981, Ieng Sary, Pol Pot's brother-in-law, Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, when confronted with copies of S-21 prison documents that I and others had published, admitted that these documents were accurate evidence of his regime's torture and murder. But he then backtracked and had an anonymous aide deny that he had made the statement. In 1988, Pol Pot himself blamed most of his regime's killings on, quote, Vietnamese agents, unquote. In 1991, Ieng Sary again rejected the genocide allegations. A lie, he said. I am human. I never thought I committed acts of genocide. I shall never recognize that. Yes, I regret that I could not efficiently oppose erroneous points of view which prevailed at certain times. I regret I had not the courage to directly oppose some people. Maybe I could not have stayed alive until now, unquote. However, the diary of an aide to Ieng Sary reveals the following views promulgated at meetings of Sary's foreign ministry in 1976 and 1977. Quote, in our country, 1% to 5% are traitors, boring in. The enemies are on our body, among the military, the workers, in the cooperatives, and even in our ranks. The enemies must be progressively wiped out, unquote. In 2004, Khieu Samphan, for his part, published an evasive memoir in Khmer, French, and English entitled Cambodia's Recent History and the Reasons Behind the Decisions I Made. Though based at Khmer Rouge headquarters in early 1975, Samphan said he had been, quote, profoundly upset by their forced evacuation of Phnom Penh in April. That was something, quote, I was not expecting at all, he said. Meanwhile, the Khmer Rouge had forcibly collectivized the country. Quote, great was my surprise, he claimed, on learning of this soon after their 1975 victory. The minutes of 15 meetings of the regime's most powerful body, the Standing Committee of the Central Committee of the ruling Communist Party of Kampuchea, held between October 1975 and May 1976, record that Samphan attended at least 12 of these 15 meetings. The Central Committee appointed him head of state on March 30th, 1976. In April 1977, Somporn stated publicly, quote, "We must wipe out the enemy and suppress all stripes of enemy at all times," unquote. Yet in his 2004 book, he claimed he knew little of the genocide, blaming it on rarely specified, quote, Khmer Rouge leaders, unquote, who had excluded him and kept him uninformed. I think we could regard this as belonging to the category of Tony Taylor's, quote, simple denial. The view of Nguyen Chia, Pol Pot's second in command, was extensively recorded in the book Behind the Killing Fields, published in 2010, based on 1,000 hours of interviews with him. Quote, "I didn't know about the killings and I did not order them," Chia claimed. Quote, "People should realize that the Khmer Rouge leaders were not cruel. We didn't frequently inspect the areas. So in some places, the top leaders didn't know what was going on, and sometimes the region didn't tell us. So everyone was doing what they wanted and not telling us. I just got reports about good things," unquote. He even claimed that in a half century of warfare and revolutionary activity, he, quote, "never struck a man down with a fist, an axe, or a gun," unquote. This too seems a clear case of simple denial. Over the 20th century, Southeast Asia, like other regions of the world, has seen examples of an ugly progression from emulation of anti-Semitism to Holocaust distortion to Holocaust emulation to simple genocide denial. But it is equally important to point out that just as in other regions of the world, each case in Southeast Asia, from the Philippines to Cambodia, has also produced examples of rescue, resistance, and a willingness to face the truth. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Kiernan, for this fascinating talk, which I think highlighted so many intriguing tropes, illustrating a global approach to the history of genocide, also history of anti-Semitism and racism, and the history of fascism as a global phenomenon. Thank you very much again. I would like to once again encourage participants to share their comments and questions in the chat box. But before we go to the open discussion, I would like to introduce our discussant, Dr. Theresa de Langis, a good friend of the Never Again Association. She is the director of the Center of Southeast Asian Studies and professor in Global Affairs and Humanities at the American University of Phnom Penh, which is one of the partners of this symposium. Dr. de Langis served in the US government, as well as a senior technical advisor to the United Nations throughout Asia. Based in Cambodia since 2012, Theresa teaches and conducts research on subjects such as gender and development, genocide and peace and conflict studies, also the literature and film of Southeast Asia. And may I also add, she was a key organizer of a global conference of the International Association of Genocide Scholars that took place in Phnom Penh. That was a very memorable event. So Theresa, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And it's such an honor to be here and to be in the position to respond to Dr. Kiernan, whose work has been very important, I think, to every genocide scholar who's especially focusing on Cambodia, but mine in particular. So I'm really happy, and I'll explain that in a moment, but so I'm so happy to have this opportunity to thank you for your scholarship throughout these years. It's also so great to hear from some of our friends here in Cambodia, from the Bopana Center and Basal, I don't know, or Sayana, but I'm really looking forward. I really enjoyed your comments and I look forward to meeting you. And thank you to the Never Again Association for really making these cross-cultural dialogues possible. So Dr. Kiernan, your work has been really important to me in terms of understanding a little bit better sexual violence in the Cambodian scenario. And we know that racism always involves some kind of control over the reproductive body. And we see that very explicitly in the Khmer Rouge regime with forced marriage and forced consummation. And I always also really appreciated your use of the personal story and the story of survivors and refugees and witnesses, and that you even allowed those important perspectives to help you to better understand the depths of suffering under the regime. I too use a lot of oral history and personal testimony, and it's so great to see younger practitioners carrying that on. I also have been inspired by last night's lecture, and I think this is indirectly influenced by Dr. Kiernan in terms of what the speaker was calling the symbolical elite, those who control the production of discourse, and those people also control our histories and therefore our futures. And therefore documentation from below becomes that much more imperative. And some of the crimes that were happening, or the human rights violations that were happening during the Khmer Rouge time, including sexual violence, will only be historicized and preserved through, let's say, grassroots documentation and preservation. So I have a lot of debts to pay to you, and I am not nearly at your stature, but I am a professor of I am a researcher who I've lived here for 8 years now. And I also teach genocide studies in Cambodia to Cambodian students. So I first want to, so a lot of my comments will come from there. My ruminations is what I'm calling them. So first, I really want to begin by appreciating your comments and your remarks tonight, especially in terms of giving us context and history to racist ideology and its structures, and to help us understand that how even before the Holocaust, there was already a ground in a discourse that was being mobilized and mutated from Europe to Southeast Asia, and that even the name Thailand, the change of the name from Siam to Thailand, has a racial intention to it to unite the Thai race. It's so important to understand and to recognize those moments of continuity. And some of my observations are inspired by this idea, especially in your closing comments, the emulation in Southeast Asia of European anti-Semitism, Holocaust distortion, Holocaust emulation, and then simple genocide denial by the Khmer Rouge leaders. So I guess my first observation was really a question about the colonial project and expansionism. So in your paper, you talk about the Japanese, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but that somehow the colonial project could not have been possible without importing a racist ideology. And we see that throughout Southeast Asia. So of course, Thailand was not colonized, but it was part of a colonial milieu, I would say. And we see this division of races, first the classification of races and division of races used by the French, by all of the colonial powers, the Dutch, the English. And in some of those cases, we would even have, let's say, instances of at least mass atrocity, mass killings. We don't call those genocides. And so that got me really thinking about, again, who is it who is, when are we allowed to call genocide a genocide? How do we situate that in this conversation around genocide, denial, and distortion? This, as I hope you can see, is deeply influenced even by your political readings in the Genocide and Resistance of Southeast Asia, your volume. I also was curious about what would happen if we turned the gaze from the from the west to the east, right, and situated it in my adopted home here in Cambodia. So I, for example, have students who have pretty cursory but workable understanding of the Holocaust, but they're much more knowledgeable and conversant about the Japanese War of Aggression and the occupation of Southeast Asia around that time. And indeed, that moment of the Japanese occupation is part of the kind of origin stories of national independence of a lot of Southeast Asian countries after the colonial system started to collapse after World War II. For my students, it's their superficial knowledge about the Holocaust. We wouldn't call it distortion or denial, but it does provoke in me as a professor an interrogation of my own positionality as a Westerner teaching in Asia, and wondering if the distortion might be in my own expectations, that they would be more concerned with Germany or the Holocaust versus the Pacific Theater and the kinds of atrocities that were happening at that time. I just want to interject that my students know a lot more about the Holocaust than I know, than I was ever taught, not I know today, but that I was ever taught at university or below around the Pacific Theater, what was happening in the Indo-Pacific, certainly what was happening in Southeast Asia during World War II. So this is not in any ways to discount the importance of the Holocaust against the Jews as a primal moment in human history, but to even to pay homage to and to reinforce your remarks about the importance of keeping these genocidal practices in conversation and in relationship to each other to understand both the continuities, but also sometimes the disruptions. One of the classes that I teach my students, university level students, is called actually Genocide in Southeast Asia. And there's a few things that are interesting about that class. So first of all, most of my students, and I have seen this changed over the year, but pretty universally, they know about the genocide and they have learned, especially from the ECC, the kind of historical narrative around the genocide in Cambodia. And they're always surprised in the class to see that there are other genocides in other places, because their genocide is where they really are focused on their attention. It's also where the gaze from the international audience is always focused. So first is to realize that there's other genocides, they still happen, and people still don't really care much that they happen. Secondly is how little they know about their own genocide in relationship to how much research has been done about it. And thirdly, more generally, how Asia itself as a region is barely represented in the typical survey textbook of genocide studies. So just as we might question how laws, as a feminist and as someone focusing on sexual violence, I'm always seeing how laws can exclude certain types of victims, certain types of people. And this legal definition of genocide, as we've already discussed a little bit tonight, and thank you, Helen Jarvis, for your intervention earlier, that definition also seems to exclude an entire region. So we don't talk about genocide in Southeast. Genocide doesn't get talked about. In fact, when we were holding the Genocide Conference in 2019, the International Association of Genocide Scholars, a lot of Southeast Asian countries did not want to be associated because of that word genocide, which is its own kind of genocide denial, but we've already decided that in many of those situations, those would be maybe mass atrocities, but they would not rise to the level of genocide. So I guess my question is, where, especially to you, because you are a historian of global genocide, how relevant, how did the convention the Genocide Convention itself integrate mass atrocity in Asia. So what were their considerations of the Nanjing massacre, or the massacre in Singapore against the Chinese who were politically vocal? In fact, in terms of the Chinese being the Jews of Asia, there are multiple examples of mass killings of Chinese throughout Southeast Asia at different times. Was there consideration of the comfort women of the Japanese Imperial Army, or the blatant sexual slavery of native female populations and colonized Korean women? Some of those things have been intentionally excluded because of foreign and political policy concerns. But there's so many other examples too of things that we don't know if we're by not turning our gaze to the East, and really, especially if we're looking for new definitions for genocide, to take all of those things into consideration. I want to end by saying, for me, genocide and the memory of genocide, whether that's historical truth or it's distortion or denial, it has a life cycle. It changes over time as power changes over time, and power means who gets to tell the story, who gets to produce the discourse in this instance. So I end with this rumination and even a question. When I drive, if you drive the road from Phnom Penh to Kampot, you can see the kettles in the earth from the bombs dropped on the US in the 1970s. And once I was told by an abbey and a pagoda that those kettles were used as mass graves to bury the civilians who had been killed by the bombing. And then later, those same kettles were used as the mass graves for the KR dead from starvation, illness, execution. Today, when you drive down that road, many of those kettles are filled with monsoon rain, front yard ponds blooming with water lilies. So my question, I guess, just to end, and this is not really a question, it is a rumination, but when does genocide begin and how does it end? And how do we reckon with the bones mixed in a mass grave on a Kampot roadside? So thank you so much for allowing me to have this time to just give some thoughts and responses to your wonderful comments.
Thank you very much, Theresa. Professor Kiernan, would you like to respond?
Thank you, Theresa, for those very thoughtful and fascinating comments, and also very informative comments. I learned a lot from what you said. I'd like to respond just to a couple of the points. I think it's very important, the point you made about colonialism being based on racism. It was an issue that I didn't touch on, the colonial influence that was certainly powerful in the rise of, well, contributing to racism. Of course, it's not as if Southeast Asia didn't have a significant amount of racism before either colonialism or the influence of anti-Semitism or the parallels to anti-Semitism influencing Southeast Asia. There was racial antagonisms in Southeast Asia going back centuries, but these were in some ways exaggerated, sometimes deliberately. I think it's true to say that the French colonial regime sought to take advantage of Khmer, Vietnamese antagonisms and differences, and sometimes did increase the divisions. One example is when the Khmer peasantry in the east of Cambodia started to show an interest in the Cao Dai religion across the border in Vietnam, the French, as well as the Buddhist hierarchy and the royalty in Cambodia, all cracked down. They didn't like the idea of Khmer's and Vietnamese worshipping in the same religion, and the Cambodians were banned from participating in it, although Vietnamese in Cambodia were not. And so this is an example of the colonial regime exacerbating ethnic divisions for its political interest. But I did make the point that Thailand was the only country that wasn't colonized by the Western powers, and yet it did develop quite a strong influence, quite a strong influence of even though, as the King Vajirabhut wrote, you know, he was very proud of Thai equality with the Westerners, but when it came to the Jews or the Chinese, he didn't take an anti-racist viewpoint, to put it mildly, to put it that way. So the lack of colonialism there in Thailand was no help, I think, in mitigating racist ideas that were still coming from Europe, but also I think fell on fertile soil, at least in the Thai political elite, the Siamese political elite. You're right also to point out that, you know, colonial conquests led to mass atrocities, some of which might have been close to what we would now call legally genocide. Certainly, they would classify in some cases as extermination, which is the next point I want to make, that there are plenty of cases that do clearly come under the legal concept of extermination, which is not the same as genocide and much less difficult to prove, not having the requirement of the proof of specific intent to destroy a group as such, and nor does it have to be an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group in the case of extermination. It can be a political group, for instance, or a social group. And so extermination is a term that was used by the inquiry group that inquired into East Timor, sponsored by the UN, and they came up with the conclusion that Indonesians in East Timor may well have committed extermination. They didn't use the word genocide in that case, although some people might think that it would be justified. And so many of the mass atrocities committed by the colonial regimes, although they, you know, in many cases were after the minerals or the products, they were also after the labor of the colonial conquered peoples, and were not necessarily out to commit genocide against them, but may well have committed extermination in the conquest. And of course, there were other genocides that took place in the pre-colonial period in Southeast Asia, the Vietnamese conquest of Champa, some of the mutual atrocities committed by Cambodians against Vietnamese, by Vietnamese against Cambodians, by Mons against Burmans, and Burmans against Mons, were in my view, genocidal. The case of the US bombing, the statement that became publicized or became declassified by Henry Kissinger, passing on the order of President Nixon in December of 1970, passing on the order to General Haig to bomb Cambodia. He said that he wants, I can't remember the words, except for anything that flies on anything that moves. He wants an upgraded, extensive bombing campaign, anything that flies on anything that moves. Now that could be interpreted, I think, possibly as an exterminatory order, perhaps even genocidal order by Nixon via Kissinger to General Haig. It certainly led to, or it was part of a major bombing campaign. However, in the following months, there was not a huge increase in the bombing. The huge increase came in 1973. A substantial increase came in 1972, I believe, but not in 1971. In the immediate months, the bombing continued, but it wasn't. The order wasn't followed by conducting of a major increase of bombing intensity in Cambodia. So it's difficult to interpret that as having led to what you might call genocide, but certainly the order itself is quite startling. Anything that flies on anything that moves. In terms of the Tokyo Tribunal and the crimes committed by the Japanese during World War II, I think it's important to note that genocide wasn't part of the charges or the convictions. The war crimes and aggression and were the main charges, as I understand it. And it's quite possible that had charges been laid, they might have been led to convictions of either extermination or genocide. But of course, genocide was not a crime at the time. So I appreciate all the comments that you've made. I think you've made a great contribution to the discussion, and thanks again for what you've mentioned.
Thank you very much. We have some questions in the chat, which I am going to read out. I appreciate the time you have already given us, but I hope it's okay with you if we spend some more minutes on this discussion. I just wanted to ask a question which might seem a little detailed vis-a-vis the globality of this conversation, but I think it's relevant, and there is no better authority to ask than Ben Kiernan. You mentioned the phrase Holocaust emulation, and in this context, I wanted to ask, on the basis of all the evidence that you have, how can you evaluate the awareness of European history, World War II, and especially the Holocaust, on the part of the Khmer Rouge leadership? I remember I found this book by Norodom Sihanouk in the library of the American University of Phnom Penh, in which he claimed that Pol Pot himself had a bit of an obsession with Hitler. I think of all the leaders, probably Khieu Samphan had the broadest horizon and intellectual awareness, if that's the right way to put it. I think it's a little known fact that he visited Poland in, I believe, in the early 70s. So he may have learned something about Polish history and the Nazi Holocaust. But have you come across any evidence suggesting that they, did it cross their minds they were doing something similar to what the Nazis did? Thank you.
Yes, that's a good question, but my answer is no. I think the emulation that is applicable in the case of the Khmer Rouge is Stalinism and Maoism. But I think the other major factor is racism, but that was homegrown. Nguyen Chia talks about what Pol Pot said to him was that I hated, I'm not quoting exactly, but I hated the Vietnamese from the time I was young. This was not something that they picked up from abroad. This was homegrown ethnic chauvinism and racism that was part of traditional Cambodian racism. Not all Cambodians shared it, but Pol Pot certainly did, and I think some of the other leaders of the regime. They also thought that they could use it to whip up support amongst a certain segment of Cambodian society. Not all, but when they wanted to resort to that kind of whipping up of public support, they thought, perhaps correctly to some extent, incorrectly to some extent as well, that it would serve them well politically to declare their enmity to what they call the hereditary enemy. And this is racial language. This is not coming from Stalinism or Maoism. but I don't think it's coming from Nazism either. I don't think that they were influenced by Nazism. Their racism was homegrown, just like anti-Semitism was in Europe. When I talked about Holocaust emulation, I was referring to the example I gave from Ngo Dinh Khan in South Vietnam, that specific case. But Holocaust denial, yes, in the case of the Khmer Rouge, the way they denied their genocide, I think it's very similar to the phenomenon that we are familiar with in the case of Holocaust denial, simple denial, as Tony Taylor calls it. But the way the Khmer Rouge regime and its leaders entangled Stalinism, Maoism, and racism is what I would call sui generis. It's a case quite unique in global history. It doesn't mean that it's unfamiliar. Its elements are unfamiliar, but the way they mingled their various influences, indigenous and external, is particular to the Cambodian case.
Thank you very much. The next question is a big question from Vishal Sorn. Professor Ben, do you think America should be responsible for the genocide in Cambodia as well, and in which way?
Well, there's two questions there. One is, did America commit genocide? And I think that's the answer to that is no. Did America commit war crimes? I think the answer to that is yes. As I mentioned earlier, a statement like bomb anything use anything that flies to bomb anything that moves could even be considered not only war crimes but extermination. But I think it depends on what happened afterwards and whether the level and intensity of the bombing that followed that order. There are obviously other orders because the bombing increased in 1973 to the extent that in the first 8 months of that year, half of the bombing that took place in the first 8 months of 1973, whereas the B-52 bombing began in 1969 at a much lower level, although it took casualties, and civilian casualties occurred in large numbers from 1969 to 1972. But then the tonnage of the bombing doubled in the next 8 months. And so there were obviously orders that may not yet have been declassified. And we would need to look at that as well. The next question, though, the second question is, to what extent did the United States bombing contribute to the rise of the regime of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge? And did it therefore contribute to the outcome of a genocidal regime? And I think it did. I think the evidence from victims of the bombing and survivors of the bombing, whom I interviewed and wrote about in an article I published in 1989 in Vietnam Generation, and other evidence, including evidence from the US government declassified documents and so on. All this evidence suggests that the bombing, although it killed not just civilians, but also members of the Khmer Rouge armed forces, but it was so widespread that it killed large numbers of civilians. I would say 50,000 to 150,000 is my estimate, with the likelihood that it was more than 100,000 killed, Cambodian civilians killed. And that impact enraged and alienated many Cambodian peasants and made them more likely to join the opposition to the bombing, the Khmer Rouge armed forces. And the Khmer Rouge armed forces grew in the period of the bombing by successful recruitment from a few thousand in 1969 when the bombing began to more than 200,000 troops and militia in 1973. So this was a massive increase during the period of the bombing, and there are many witnesses and US documents that testify to the fact that the Khmer Rouge were much more easily able to recruit troops and militia because of the impact of the bombing and popular resentment at the bombing. And of course, the Khmer Rouge used this. They told people that they would use their armed forces to end the bombing, that the killing birds came from Phnom Penh, which was a lie. They came from the Philippines, Guam, and Thailand, but that they told their recruits that they were going to overthrow the Lon Nol government in Phnom Penh, and that would stop the bombing. And so there is plenty of evidence that the bombing contributed to the facility with which the Khmer Rouge recruited the army that they used to seize power. But that's not the only reason that they were able to take power. They also benefited from the political support of Prince Sihanouk, who was very popular in Cambodia even after his overthrow, and the fact that he was on their side helped the Khmer Rouge recruit and take power. And they also had the benefit of an alliance with the Vietnamese communists who trained some of their troops and gave them weapons and so on. So there were three factors, I think, that enabled the Khmer Rouge to take power. But one of these three significant factors was the US bombardment of Cambodia. More than 500,000 tons of bombs fell on Cambodia. Wedding parties were slaughtered. Funeral processions were bombed. Villages were destroyed. And many of the survivors joined the Khmer Rouge army.
Thank you very much. I think the last question comes from Samantha Moreno. I would like to ask Mr. Kiernan, what can be the implications for governments in their decision to use the term ethnic cleansing or internal conflict instead of genocide, with the intent of contravening the legal frameworks that the concept of genocide carries for them?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. The term ethnic cleansing first came to my attention in the 1990s with the Bosnian conflict. And that was a term that I used consonant with the term genocide in my book, The Pol Pot Regime. In fact, the chapter on genocide is in fact termed ethnic cleansing. But since then, the term has become much more precise, and ethnic cleansing doesn't have a legal meaning, whereas genocide does have a legal meaning. But ethnic cleansing has now come, since I published the book in 1996, ethnic cleansing implies the use of force to drive people out, including perhaps genocidal means to force them to flee, killing large numbers of them perhaps is one way, using genocide as a means to impose ethnic cleansing. But there is a sense that the victims of ethnic cleansing have a reservation to go to or a refuge to go to, and that the ultimate aim is not to destroy the population who are being ethnically cleansed. So now there is a distinction between ethnic cleansing and genocide. And apart from the fact that the term ethnic cleansing it doesn't have a legal meaning and is rather imprecise, but it does now have this sense of a refuge that people can, as long as they leave the territory from which they're being driven away, have some sense of survival, whereas genocide doesn't necessarily imply that at all. So some people have, and some governments may have a reluctance to use the term genocide and may prefer to use ethnic cleansing, which doesn't immediately trigger any obligation on their part if they're the signatories of the Genocide Convention. If they use the term genocide, they may have obligations as a result of their participation in the Genocide Convention. And if they use the term ethnic cleansing, they don't have any legal obligations. There may be different reasons why the term ethnic cleansing is used. The reason I used it in the book was that it seemed to be synonymous with genocide from the Bosnian conflict.
Well, thank you very much once again. Big thanks to Ben Kiernan, to Theresa de Langis. We are coming to an end of our session today. I appreciate, especially in Southeast Asia, it is quite late already. So thank you to the participants who are with us. Let me just advertise the program for tomorrow, which I think is also going to be very interesting. We are going to start a little earlier tomorrow, so that will be 4 p.m. Bangkok time and 10 a.m. Warsaw time. We are going to have a conversation with the Chief Rabbi of Poland, Michael Szudrik, moderated by Venerable Lablu Barua. We are going to have very interesting presentations about dealing with the past and genocide denial in Thailand and Myanmar. And then we are going to have a very interesting panel discussion on challenging genocide distortion. So I would like to encourage everybody to log in tomorrow, 4 p.m. Bangkok time, 10 a.m. Central European time. The Zoom link, if you haven't got it, is also in the chat, but everybody should have received it over email. So thank you once again, and I look forward to meeting tomorrow again. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye. Have a nice day.